Hello, and welcome to another episode of Be the Love to Awaken Our Souls. Thank you again so much for tuning in this week. I'm Stacy Musial.
And I am Brenda Carey with our special guest, Matt Cooksey. We are your co-hosts and souls on the journey, and we are on a mission to raise the consciousness of humans and the planet, and we need your help. Please spread the word to your family and friends and join us every week. Consider becoming a Patreon supporter or a sponsor to help with the operating costs like editing and the many hours we spend creating these shows with quality guests and content. And if you have resonated with our mission, support us in a way that raises your vibration to love.
And if it feels safe for you, I'd like to invite you to take a moment to get centered with us. I'd like to begin by inviting you to take a beautiful cleansing breath in through your nose and out through your mouth, releasing anything that is keeping you from being present. And take another deep breath in through your nose, breathing in calm, peaceful, loving energy, and breathing out anything you are ready to release in this now moment. And take one more breath in through your nose, breathing in light and love for yourself. And imagine breathing that light and love and send it back to all of humanity, remembering that you always, always have your breath to come back to.
Our guest today is Matt Cooksey. Matt is a psychotherapist on a mission to make a Google map of your psyche. I love that. An early midlife crisis at 30 left him exploring uncharted parts of himself in search of the inner gold he sensed within. For 8 years, he journeyed through a conflicted, tumultuous psyche before unearthing the infinite internal source of love, wisdom, and creativity he was searching for. But it was daunting and disoriented, which inspired him to create a unique way for a person to map their own psyche, so thousands more people can confidently and efficiently navigate their way to the inner gold they need to lead inspired and authentic lives. Thank you so much for being here with us today, Matt.
Goodness me, I am so delighted to be with you both and just so curious about what's going to unfold in our conversation. So it's just wonderful to be here. And for everybody listening, I just want you to know that I so appreciate you being here. So I look forward to it.
Thank you. We are so grateful to have this beautiful conversation. And you're right, however it unfolds. I am curious, though, what has led you down this journey and on your spiritual path?
Gosh, I think like a lot of people, the simple answer to that question is pain and suffering. It all began for me, as I said in the bio, around 30. You know, if you're going to have a midlife crisis, you might as well do it early. And I apparently got it out of the way early. And I really had achieved a lot of the things that we're all raised to believe are going to make us happy. You know, the usual laundry list of houses and cars and holidays and all of that stuff. And I was miserable. And I had this hilarious moment on my 30th birthday where I was running on a treadmill, doing what I was very good at doing, like bypassing all of my difficult, painful emotions by pounding on this treadmill. And I actually fell off the treadmill and I fell off it. And I was just at the lowest point. And funnily enough, now when I look back, it occurs to me that a treadmill is a road to nowhere. And that actually escaped me at the time. But I laugh about it now, as you can, like 13 years on. And I went to the jacuzzi that this gym had downstairs, and I sat there in this jacuzzi, the most depressed I think I'd ever been, lost, confused, frightened. And it was like a parting of all of these clouds where probably for the first time in my life, I consciously heard the voice of what we could say is my higher self, or the universe, or God, whatever your word is for that. But I consciously heard myself, and it said to me, it's funny, that language, it said to me, which really shows you and speaks to the great chasm I experienced at that time in my life between who I thought I was and who I actually turned out to be. And it just said to me, you don't have to do any of this. And it sounds so kind of like basic now when I say it, but at the time it was like earth-shattering. It was earth-shattering. And I literally quit my high-paying corporate job a week later and went and lived in Argentina for a while and traveled for a year, absolutely with this really interesting determination that came, I think, from that meeting, that momentary meeting of myself, that suddenly brought or shifted the energy from going into all of this achieving and people pleasing that I was up to prior to that, and shifted it into the internal journey. And I was, from that point forward, and that's like 13 years ago, I was voracious in this search. I was, people around me were like, oh my God, people could see I meant business, like, which was in itself a bit of a problem at times, but that's a whole other story. And I hope that gives you a bit of a sense of, just how this began for me.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing a little bit about your journey. It sounds like a powerful shift and awakening for you. And so tell us a little bit more about what that, going from this external people pleasing, the material world, and recognizing that those things weren't important anymore, to shifting to the internal world. And what was that like for you? And were there any certain processes you used, or tell us a little bit more about that piece.
It's really interesting because in many ways this links with the notion of helping people to develop what I call like a Google map for the psyche, because what I found was that I initially kind of went into just that first uncharted layer of self-inquiry. What are my values? What are my passions? What are my talents? What do I really want to do? But it was still very much framed around this separate, vulnerable Matt identity. But there was just this beginning of a traveling beyond what I had known of myself, and then a sort of expansion. And what I found is that was really just that was like the entree, and actually it was so funny because about maybe 3 or 4 years later, I'd really kind of transformed my life. I had gone back to university, studied to become a therapist. I had moved from London, where I was living, to the other side of the world, to Australia. And I just about changed every facet of my life on the basis of this intuition. You don't have to do anything.
Sounds like a powerful ego death.
Well, it was, except for the fact that I sat there outside my private therapy practice with my dream life in place now, and felt very much the same. And I was like, oh no, I have changed just about everything out there. And I'm still feeling this, that there's something missing, that there's something not right, that I'm not enough, that I've got to always keep striving and pushing, and the same essential kind of perfume of me, I'm still wearing it. And it was like, oh no. And that was really then when things really started to crank up, and it became so much more transformative as I began to really question the very sense of what I actually am. What am I? Who am I? And the reason now that I love to help people develop these maps of their psyche is that I found, as my own self-inquiry became more and more deep and into the really uncharted parts of the psyche, it became very disorientating at times, very lonely. I had this strong intuition that there was this well of gold, and that's why I love the work that you both do, because you're really evoking and speaking to that which is in all of us. And that's really what I sensed too, that intuitively felt that there is more to me, there is more to life, and I've got to find it. But goodness me, as I entered into a world of who am I, what am I, outside of all my identities, goodness me, that became a really confusing, disorientating place, very transformative. And what I found was that actually having a map really emboldened me to go to places I probably wouldn't have gone otherwise, because I felt more confident that if I got lost, you know, as you both know, the process of awakening has so many cul-de-sacs and dead ends and one-way streets. And it's like I was saying to a colleague earlier, you know, it's almost like in the quote unquote real world, at least if you go to a strange city, the roads and everything might be unfamiliar, but at least they stay the same, and you can over time get your bearings and so on. You go into the psyche, and one day you go down a road and you're like, whoa, this is cool. I'm going down this road and it's leading me to this insight and so forth. The next day you're like, okay, I'm going to go down that road again. And you go there and it's like, it's not even there anymore. It doesn't actually exist anymore. And you're like, oh my God. And so it can become so disorientating. And that's what I found. And when I ultimately found what I intuited is in all of us, and I know with all my heart, to anyone who's listening to this who doubts that, who wonders, I hear this from these people that this is in me, but is it really? I know with all my heart that is in all of us. And yet it is so easy to get lost on this journey and stuck, and it can feel frightening and lonely. And so I think that's what we three all share in this great love of wanting to support people through that, you know.
I'm so glad you bring up that this journey isn't all, you know, rainbows and unicorns. I mean, I know we say a spiritual journey and there's always supposed to be, we think, the light at the end of the tunnel, you know, but sometimes the tunnel seems long and confusing and disorienting. And then we start to think, well, am I doing this right? I thought this was supposed to be the spiritual path. And there is a lot of bypassing that can happen because we're thinking it's going to be the pot of gold right away at the end. And I think that's a really good point to bring up, is that there are going to be those shadow times to work through. And I love your analogy of a map. I actually, I guess I'm a little more old school. I've used the analogy, but it's a trail map, like actual paper.
That's a good one
I'm
too.
a hiker, and so I do look at our depth journeys as a map. And for me, it's elevation and mountains and twists and turns. But I love this idea of a Google map. And so I'm curious, when we are in these shadow dark tunnel times, like the one you experienced, you mentioned like shame and insecurity, like what does that process feel like, look like for someone who might be going through it or questioning, like, is this my map? Like where do I go when there doesn't seem to be the quote unquote right road to follow?
I love your question and really drawing out for people that this process of awakening can often be fierce. I think it's Ramdas coined the term fierce grace. He had a stroke a few years before he died, and he said he was stroked by his guru, and he described his stroke as a fierce grace that just woke him up even more. And so I think people are not often prepared for or attuned to the idea that wisdom can actually arrive, and very often does, in the form of pain, setback, frustration, failure, all of these things. And if you don't know that or are not open to the possibility that what you see as a bad thing might actually be an intelligent form of life arising in you, then I think that's the first point at which you could get really lost, because you could be like, well, isn't this spiritual journey meant to be all joy and love and peace and all that kind of stuff? And that's just not been my experience. In fact, I just feel like awakening for me has, like, there's this particular time I was just telling Stacy and Brenda before we started this conversation that I'm speaking today from the beautiful island of Bali. And I think, to go to your question, Brenda, the best example I can think of for somebody who might be kind of in that dark tunnel moment is actually took place 5 years ago whilst I was on the island of Bali. And to give you a little context, it's quite a funny story, actually. My husband now, he wasn't my husband then, had come home one day about 5 years ago, and he looked pale and said to me, I don't want to be with you anymore. And I had put this guy on a massive pedestal, and it was the worst possible thing I could have heard. And the instant terror and all of my attachment, trauma, abandonment stuff, like, talk about like a dark night moment. And I will never forget the intuition I had as he then left our apartment to just sit myself in our spare room on the couch. And it occurred to me, sit on this chair and do not move until you have felt every wretched, painful, agonizing feeling that you are feeling right now. You need to feel it. And I sat there, and I don't know how long I was sitting there, but it was like I was being ripped apart as I was feeling these feelings that, in the book, The Untethered Soul by Michael Singer, he talks about this layer of pain that is so painful and so challenging that our whole personality revolves around avoiding it and never touching it. It felt like I was finally journeying through this agonizing pain of the worst possible thing I could have imagined at that time actually coming true. And however long I was sitting there, it was so shocking to me that I, at some point, popped out the other side into this totally improbable, and to my mind, like, bizarre peace. Like, it was like total acceptance about 16 hours after hearing the news, which is not to say that later on I didn't experience waves of grief and processing emotionally what had happened. But it was incredible. And the funniest thing then happened. I had this intuition just start like chiming in, and the intuition said, of all things, you need to go to a nudist beach. I'd never been to a nudist beach in my life. And I was like, well, everything's screwy right now in my life, so I might as well just see where this goes. So I drove to this nudist beach. And for the guy who had spent his life hiding his body, trying to be someone, putting his partner on a pedestal, all of this stuff, it really occurred to me that there was something quite profound about being naked I went to this beach. I drove like 2 hours to get to this beach I'd never been to before. I took all my clothes off. I ran into the water. And 24 hours after hearing this awful news, I felt this ecstatic joy. And thank God I was a therapist, because if I hadn't have been, I would have thought I was going crazy. And so that's, I think, one of the things that can happen for people is they can be having an awakening experience like that, where there's these huge oscillations in their emotional experience, and they can start to feel a bit nutty, a little bit like crazy, and their behavior can seem to other people around them to be erratic. Like, you're going to a nudist beach and people can start projecting on you, and it can get really confusing, because I was then driving back from this beach and I'm driving down the freeway and I had this impulse that I need to go to Bali. And I was like, my mind was like, you can't go to Bali. Like, you've got all these reasons you need to not do that. And I was like, okay, well, if I really need to go to Bali, give me a sign, universe. And the universe does not mess around with this stuff, does it? Like,
Nope.
I'm driving along and my eye goes to this big office building to my right, and emblazoned across the office building was one word, and it said ego, EGO. And it happened to be the name of this pharmaceuticals company. And I instantly knew that the message was, the only reason you're not going to go to Bali and follow this intuition is because of your ego. So I get home and I load up flights to Bali, and I'm hovering over the like book button, and I've got no reason to stay really in Australia at that point. Like, there's no reason to not go. And I'm like, I'm so sorry, universe, for being a slow student here, but I need another sign, like, before I actually follow through on this. And I just glanced over to the desk, and at the side of the desk, and I saw this hand cream sitting there, and I suddenly saw the logo on the hand cream. It was made by Ego, the pharmaceutical company I'd just seen on the side of the road. And I instantly hit the book button. And 2 weeks later, I arrived in Bali, and a much longer story, but in many ways, being in Bali led me to rekindle my relationship with that very same person who said they didn't want to be with me. And he's now my husband, and we've been married for 5 years. We have 3 small children, and our love and our relationship is not perfect by any stretch, but we are, we're really where we need to be. And so it's just I hope that kind of story gives some answer to your question, Brenda, of how it can look in the tunnel. Like, it was very confusing, but also so exciting.
I absolutely love that. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think it just really shows, I mean, you were willing, when he said he didn't want to be with you anymore, you were able to sit with all those emotions. And it can be so easy to want to get up and distract and, zone out on something else, or go, drink, or whatever the case may be, right? And I think that has been maybe some patterns, but with people, and especially in our culture, we're taught, and those emotions are dark and scary. And so, but you were able to, it sounds like, really step in and feel them and allow them, and just move through the energy, and then listen to your inner guidance system on what was the next step in the process. And it sounds like you really were able to shift your own energy, rather than also, blaming your partner and really, putting it on him, right? So what that was like. So recognizing that you took the responsibility of how that, showed up for you. So I think that's where maybe a lot of people can get stuck in that energy, and, wanting to shift focus, right? And so I'm wondering if how are there any tools or anything that you could recommend, or helping to support people to, really taking the courage to sit through that pain, so that they can move through it and experience the other side?
Yeah, I think what you've just identified is so critical on this path, to be able to work with intense emotion. I think in spirituality, and I have totally engaged in this a lot, we can be really prone to using, the awakenings that we have along the way as a way to avoid having to actually go to these difficult, dark, scary places that I find to be such a portal for us. And so I think to your point about like what practically can people do to set themselves up to make it more likely they're going to be able to actually really go there and engage with their shadows and so forth. For me, there have been 3 primary tools, if we want to say that, or kind of methodologies that for me have really I've kind of pulled together in this notion of creating a map of the psyche. And one in particular that I'll really share that I think can make a huge and immediate difference for people is really realizing that, how we talk about me or I or myself, and we talk about it as if it's a unitary, singular entity. And what I find to be more true, not necessarily the truth, but more true, certainly, is that actually this psychological self, if I can call it that, this egoic self, is actually, in the vast majority of people, fragmented into a number of parts that act really quite independently and fight with one another for control in moments like that, especially. Just that experience I had of like in my own map, I have a part of me on my map that is what I call my knowing part. And it's the seat of my intuition. In many ways, it's like the spiritual representative in my psychological self. And this part is the part that sort of had me know, go to Bali. You need to go to Bali. But then there's another part of me that I call my achieving part that had just done a keynote speech at a conference in Australia that was like, you can't go to Bali. You need to be in Australia to follow up on all these business opportunities that are coming out of this conference and all of that kind of stuff. And so a fight ensues because we're divided internally. And so I think our spiritual journey very often is constrained by the fact that only a part of us is committed and on the journey itself. There are other parts that actually think the spiritual journey is a terrible idea, that actually, you want me to surrender? No way, Jose. Like, I'm not into that. You want me to feel all these difficult emotions? I don't want to do that. And so we approach spirituality in a fragmented way that reflects the fragmentation that is just there all along anyway. And so one of the most profound things that I notice happens when people actually get to map out all of the different parts of themselves is that then they actually see on a single piece of paper what parts of them actually are totally acting in opposition to awakening. And they immediately seem to then be able to access, let's say, a higher self that can bring compassion and curiosity and interest in the parts that are not interested in the spiritual journey. And what I find is that when you can actually instigate a really open dialogue with parts of you that are very skeptical about spirituality or suspicious of it or just don't want to be involved in it whatsoever, you can arrive at a place of greater integration. You can arrive at a place of a more whole spiritual process where even if, let's say, you're struggling with surrender, even if that's still very difficult for the part of you that likes to be in control of your life and everything that's going on. Now, once there's this realization that that myself is not this unitary thing, it's actually broken into these different parts. And we know this because we say, like, part of me wanted to go to Bali and part of me thought it was a bad idea. Part of me wanted to go for dinner, but part of me wants to go on a diet. Like, you know, like this is happening all the time. We know it. It's quite intuitive. And when we can become aware of that, I really think it can allow us to take a more integrated approach to our spirituality. Because then when you're struggling with surrender, you go, okay, what part of me is struggling with surrender? And you look at your map and you go, I'm pretty sure it's going to be the achieving part that likes to, you know, control and so on. And then I can call up a dialogue with that part of me and I can literally sit there and talk to it. I'm going to be like, hey, Mr. Achieving part, you know, in a kind of meditative kind of way. You know, I really feel that this is hard for you. You're being asked to surrender to this idea of going to Bali, in my case, and you don't know where it's leading and why, and all of these things that, you know, your whole life and identity has been about. How is this for you, sweetheart? Like, this is how my internal language, you know, how is that for you, sweetheart? Like, what is that like? I know that's hard, but tell me more about it. And I find that part of me will then just come into my awareness and will say, yeah, it's scary. And like, we're going to end up like broke and we're not going to have any money. And we're going to be now just like separated and bankrupt and life's going to fall apart. And I can really start to hear without getting swept away. And I think that's one of the things that I can't remember whether it was you, Brenda, or Stacy, but one of you mentioned, how do we lean into these emotional experiences without getting completely lost in them? And for me, having this sort of visual representation of my psyche really helps with that, because I can kind of really look at it but not get lost in it.
I love that example, especially with like surrender and making decisions, because I admit I do really like, it's like I bounce back and forth and then I end up with decision fatigue, you know, at the end of the day, because I'm contemplating all the different possibilities, or this might happen or that might happen. So I like how you mentioned this, like this dialogue of this part of ourselves. And I think that's a really beautiful practice. I'm actually going to try that on when I'm, you know, wrestling with like, what kind of decision do I need to make here, whether it's personal or business related. I am curious though, because, and I'm reflecting to myself, there was a point in time, and I'm much better at this, where my internal dialogue or that conversation would have been pretty negative and kind of nasty. And I think a lot of people do struggle with negative self-talk and negative self-image. I'm not enough. You know, I'm not able to, you know, make this decision wisely. What would you say to that person who maybe can't quite get into that very loving conversation, very grace-filled conversation? What are the steps to get there if they're just not quite in that space yet?
I am so glad that you asked that question, because it really, this is vital, what you just pointed out. And there have been a number of steps that I had to take to be able to speak in that way. And it's actually quite simple, but it's not easy. So the simple way that I guide people to approach a moment where they're really in some shame, self-criticism, attack or spiral, and they're really struggling to relate, like it makes sense, like that we struggle to relate to that kind of moment with compassion because we're caught in criticism. That part of us can look like a monster. It can look like a really vicious, unkind, really awful part of us, and we just want to get rid of it, right? What's really fascinating is when you then take this idea of a self that is actually not unitary, but it's divided into parts. You can then ask yourself, which is the part of me that really sees this critical part as a vicious monster. And what I would encourage that person to do is not try to speak to the part that's spouting all of this bile and you're a terrible person and you're useless and rubbish and whatever it's saying to you. Because what needs to happen first is there is that part, and then there's another part, because you're saying, like, I don't know how to be in relationship with that self-critical part in a way that is compassionate. And what that tells me is that our higher self is not online in that moment. There is another part eclipsing that higher self. And so now what you have is these two psychological entities battling out in a drama triangle kind of perpetrator and victim kind of dynamic. And so what I would encourage anyone to do in that situation would be, you can literally say this to the critical part. You can say, I totally want to come and hear you. I hear that you have some very urgent and important things to say to me. And I would like you to take a step back for a moment, because there is another part of me right now that is very afraid of you, that is very afraid and needs me to hold it first. And then I will be able to come over here and I will be available to hear you. But I'm not going to be able to hear you whilst the part in here is really frightened. So would you be willing to just step back for a moment? And 9 times out of 10, I find that because basically the bottom line is, what you see in the end is that there are no bad parts, that even these really vicious, critical parts actually are so beautiful. They are not monsters at all. They are more like misunderstood geniuses that have been cast out so long they've kind of become they look like monsters, but they're not. And so 9 times out of 10, I find when I'm working with people that their self-critical part will actually say, okay, I get that, I'll step back. And then we turn to whatever part is really frightened. And usually that's a very child-like part, an inner child part that has been, in some very difficult situations early in life. And then we need to kind of be with that and say, hey, sweetheart, and usually people can access that self-compassion towards that part of themselves. Mm-hmm. And then what you find is they've made the switch. They have to be in a subject-object relationship where the subject that they're being is their higher self, in order to bring this compassion to their, let's say, inner child part. And once they can soothe their inner child part and say, hey, sweetheart, like, you're hearing all this horrible criticism, and I know that must be so hard for you. Tell me, how are you doing? And the little child will speak, and you can hold it. And suddenly you're grounded again in your own deeper wisdom. And from there, once this little part of you has kind of settled, it becomes much more possible to then turn back to this critical part in a totally different way of being, that then has you really start to see this critical part in a very different light. And you see what I see in that part of me, because I have a very, very strong self-critical part. But over time, as I've really been able to engage in this way, I've really seen that actually it has such a strength to it, that it has such an authority to it. And in many ways right now, as I'm speaking to you in this conversation, that part of me is actually doing what it does really well by allowing me to speak with confidence and a sense of just someone who knows themselves and is just in integrity. And so that part of me allows me to have that way of being in the world. And if I was just always pushing that away because I was frightened of what looked like a monster, then I'm missing a part of me, and that's the reward. That's the golden ticket to do this very scary thing, I realize. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. I think it's, such beautiful work when we can really begin to integrate, well, first connect and talk and, recognize which part is active, right? And then to integrate with love. And it really helps that part, whenever that part was formed in our psyches and our, however old that part is, and really bring that online. You mentioned there's no bad parts, and it just reminded me of the book, No Bad Parts by Richard Schwartz, who who created the internal family systems. So, and it's such a powerful experience. I use a little bit of that, some of that in my own work as a psychotherapist. And so it's, I've just seen the shifts that clients can really have, and in my own life, as when I can, recognize which part is, active in that moment. And, I can really connect with that part and begin to nurture her and what she might not have received, and as a little girl, or, and so it's such a powerful process. We can really get those all online and working together, and they're not separate, and we can integrate that. It's so beautiful.
I love how you just summarized that, because that's what it's all about: integrating with love, with love. That's such a beautiful way of putting it. And there's such a paradox to this, I've found, because I think if you look at your behavior and your thought process and everything through the lens of a singular self, a singular entity, we all look mad as a box of frogs. Like, we seem to be so crazy and schizophrenic, and 1 minute we're over here, and we're left with this sense that we don't make sense. And yet when we start to see, oh my gosh, I've actually just got this inner crew of parts that have been disintegrated, and they're all sort of jostling, then all of a sudden our dysfunction actually starts to make sense. And when our dysfunction starts to make sense, I feel like that's a basis for really great healing work. And, when I was reading your bio, Stacy, I was like, and hearing about the work that you do, I really had that sense of you being in that space and doing that work. And I can see from the smile on your face, just, how much you love getting people into that space. So thank you for what you're doing, both of you. It's just absolutely amazing work that you both do.
Oh, thank you, Matt.
Thank you.
As we begin to wrap up this beautiful conversation, I feel like it could go on for quite a long time, but I know our listeners are going to be really curious where they can find you and what you're currently working on.
Cool. So they can come to unmystical.com, because I just want to demystify this psyche thing. That's why I picked that name, unmystical.com. And what I decided to do there is actually publish my own map, because it could, if you had to explain a Google map to an alien in words, like, they would probably have a hard time grasping it. You need to kind of see, what does a map of a psyche actually look like? What does that entail? And so I decided it would be helpful to really make my own map public material, with some commentary, so people can kind of start to grasp what I actually mean by Google Map of the Psyche. And so that's one of the things that people can immediately do if this notion kind of sounds interesting and you're curious. Come to unmystical.com and just download my map with the commentary, and you'll kind of I'll give you a guided tour of my map, and it'll kind of just start to kind of help you see the possibility of this, and the core kind of work that I do for people who are sort of the way I like to think of it is, one step is to draw the map, the next step is that in a Google map, you have a GPS signal. And I liken the GPS signal to our higher self. And that's what locates you on the map. And so I run a 10-week program, which I call the Shadow Quest, which is really a expedition into the most challenging, difficult parts of our psyche. And a big part of what we do in that process is help people find a reliable GPS signal from their higher self so that now they have the map and they can locate themselves on it. And what I find is that when I lead people on those expeditions and equip them with that, when they leave that program, they are then forever more intrepid explorers who are able to journey to the farther reaches of themselves by themselves. And I find that to be probably the most important thing about this, is to set people up to skillfully journey themselves. So that's kind of like the core of what I do. And those are intimate, small group coaching environments. And it's a privilege to do that work. It really is.
Wow, that sounds so beautiful. And what a beautiful experience to really dive deep and really get to know yourself on such a deep level, through all those layers, and finding yourself where you are, and then what and everything underneath that, right?
Right. Yeah, to really see when I say I struggle with surrender, like to really be able to dive in and uncover exactly why,
Right.
For that to no longer be a mystery, is like, it's so powerful.
To really get to know oneself is such a beautiful gift to give yourself. And that's, I think that's a deep self-love right there. And so thank you so much for being here today with us, Matt. We've really appreciated you and everything you're doing in the world, and just really loved having this conscious conversation with you. So thank you.
You're both a great gift. So thankful to have been with you too.
And thank you for listening to Be the Love podcast. If you've enjoyed listening to our show, please share the love by sharing it with your friends and family, giving us a 5-star written review on iTunes, or liking us on Facebook. Please consider supporting our mission to awaken our souls with a monthly donation that helps us with the operating costs of this podcast, so we can continue to spread the love. To contribute, visit our Patreon website at patreon.com/Be the Love podcast. And stay tuned for more episodes being released on Mondays at 5:55 a.m. Mountain Time.